You noticed it the moment you stopped texting first. The silence wasn't mutual. It was revealing. No one checked in. No one asked how you were. Days passed, and the only thing louder than the absence of words was the echo of your own realization. You were never the priority. You were the provider of attention, of effort, of presence. You were the one who remembered birthdays, made plans, listened late into the night. But when you paused, just long enough to breathe, the world you held together started pretending you never existed. That's when it hits you. Not with rage, but with something colder. Clarity. The reason they valued you was never about who you are. It was about what you gave. Your value was conditional, quietly attached to the usefulness you represented. You weren't cherished, you were accessed. And once your usefulness expired, so did their loyalty. This truth isn't just brutal, it's ancient. Even in the writings of Machiavelli, the concept of loyalty was never tied to affection. It was bound to necessity. People stay where it serves them. They align with power, not sentiment. And if your presence isn't inconvenient to replace, it becomes optional to retain. You want to believe you were the exception, that what you gave from your heart created some unspoken bond, that your gestures built something sacred. But let's strip it to the bone. How many of them would be there if you had nothing left to offer? This is where the wound begins to rot, from realizing that your kindness, your emotional availability, your patience were never mirrored back. You gave with hope. They received with expectation. And once the giving paused, the gratitude vanished. There's a sick irony in how quickly people forget the hands that held them up when they were down. They remember the help, but not the helper. They remember the result, but not the cost. You became invisible the moment you stopped being useful. And it wasn't even malicious. It was mechanical, cold, human. Think about how many relationships in your life, friendships, family ties, romantic entanglements, shifted the moment you stopped performing. It wasn't about a fight. It wasn't about betrayal. It was about redundancy. They didn't need you anymore, so they didn't keep you. You weren't loved. You were leveraged. There's a difference. This form of social currency is everywhere. You see it in the friend who only calls when they need advice, in the sibling who shows up when they're in crisis, but disappears when you are, in the partner who praised your emotional support, only to ghost you when you needed it back. It's not that they stopped loving you, it's that they never did. They loved how you made them feel, and that distinction is everything. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When people say, "You changed," what they really mean is, "You stopped being useful to me." And when they say, "You're distant," what they mean is, "You're no longer predictable." You're breaking a pattern they were addicted to, one where you gave endlessly and asked for nothing. Now that you're aware of it, you can never unsee it. Every interaction becomes a calculation. Every favor becomes a contract. Every "I miss you" feels like a sales pitch. And the worst part? You start to distrust genuine love when it finally shows up. Because you've been trained to see affection as a transaction. You didn't become cold overnight. You became cold because warmth became a liability. Because every time you opened your heart, someone took more than they gave. Every time you said yes when it hurt, someone learned that your pain was negotiable. And eventually, your silence became your shield. But that silence also became your prison. Because now, even when someone tries to truly care for you, you question their intent. You wonder what they're after. You anticipate the moment they'll leave. You scan for signs that your usefulness is the only reason they're here. And so, love can't reach you. Not because it's not real, but because you no longer believe it exists without strings. That's what being useful has done to you. It's made you cynical, defensive, wary, but it's also made you dangerous. Because once you stop tying your worth to what you provide, you become untouchable. The person who no longer needs to be needed holds the ultimate power, and that power doesn't scream. It whispers. It walks away from one-sided connections without looking back. It doesn't punish. It disappears. You're not cold. You're calculated. You're not heartless. You're healed. And now that you've seen the truth, you'll never allow yourself to be mistaken for a tool again. Shall we go deeper into what happens when you start withholding what they once depended on? Let's. You start saying no more often. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. The favors they once expected without hesitation now come with hesitation. The emotional support you used to offer at 2 a.m. suddenly isn't available. You don't explain, you don't justify, you just stop. And this silence, this absence of effort, feels like violence to the people who fed off your consistence. At first, they don't understand it. They think you're tired, distracted, going through a phase, but then it repeats. Then it becomes a pattern, and slowly, panic sets in. Not because they're losing you, but because they're losing access to what you do for them. This is the turning point where their true nature shows, not in how they celebrated you when you were useful, but in how they react now that you're setting boundaries. Some grow distant, some guilt trip. Others lash out, accusing you of being selfish, cold, even ungrateful, as if your entire existence was meant to orbit around their comfort. And that's when you realize how much your role was never about mutuality. You weren't a person. They treated you like a system, something reliable, predictable. Switch it on, and it works. Ask, and it gives. But now, the system has shut down, and the user is angry. This is what Machiavelli would call strategic withholding, not out of pettiness, but to observe, to test who remains when the giving stops, who reaches out just to see you and not to use you, who treats your silence as an opportunity for care, not confrontation. The answers aren't pretty, because most people don't want you healed. They want you useful. And healing, by nature, makes you less available to those who only knew how to take. When you shift from constant giver to quiet observer, you stop trying to fix everything. You let the chaos play out. You don't rush in with solution. You don't save them from the consequences of their choices. And that's when they call you change. That's when they say you've lost your heart. But in truth, you didn't lose your heart. You reclaimed it. You stopped handing out pieces of yourself in the hope that someone would finally see your worth. You stopped offering your time like a coupon people could redeem without gratitude. You stopped rescuing people from storms they created and then blamed on you. And the shift is powerful, not because it makes you hard, but because it makes you real. You're no longer chasing love by being indispensable. You're watching in silence who was only standing next to you because they needed shade from your tree. Now that the leaves have fallen, who's still here? Who brings water when your well runs dry? This phase of withdrawal is painful. It's lonely. Because when you stop being useful, you lose more people than you imagined. And it confirms what you feared. Many of them were never truly with you. They were with the version of you that gave affection, gave time, gave forgiveness, gave access. But now, that access is revoked. And those who never had the intention to give back walk away, quietly offended that your generosity had an expiration date. This is where your power is reborn, because now you're not responding out of desperation. You're choosing from a place of sovereignty. You speak when you want to, not when you feel obligated. You help when it aligns with your energy, not when it earns you temporary affection. And slowly, your world becomes quieter, but it also becomes cleaner. The parasites leave, the opportunists vanish, the relationships that were built on expectation crumble, and what remains, what survives, are those rare souls who see your presence as enough. No need for gifts, no need for sacrifice. Just you, standing there, with nothing in your hands except your presence. And ironically, those are the people who value you most. This is the paradox of usefulness. The more you give to be loved, the less you're respected. But the moment you stop giving, the truth surfaces, ugly, clear, undeniable. And though it stings, it liberates. Because now, you're no longer chasing validation. You're choosing who deserves access. The game has changed, and you're not the pawn anymore. Do you feel that shift? It's the sound of your own worth echoing back to you, not as applause, as peace. Now the real transformation begins, not in how you're treated, but in what you tolerate. Ready to explore what happens when you no longer accept being treated like a product instead of a person. There's a moment when it hits you, not with a bang, but with a slow ache. You're sitting across from someone who once begged for your attention, and now you can barely get a straight answer. You didn't change, you just stopped giving endlessly. And that shift, that stillness, became the beginning of your invisibility. But what if that invisibility isn't the punishment you think it is? What if it's the consequence of you no longer being needed the way they want you to be? Because people don't reject you when you're broken. They reject you when you stop being easy, when you stop filling their emotional voids, when you stop playing the role that made them feel strong while you stayed small. It's easy to confuse usefulness with love when you've been conditioned to associate giving with worth. Childhood can program that into you. Maybe your affection was only acknowledged when you were helpful. Maybe your silence was rewarded more than your needs. Maybe somewhere along the line, you became excellent at giving and invisible when you weren't. That pattern doesn't disappear just because we grow older. It mutates. Now it wears the face of relationship, of friendships, of lovers who adore you as long as you're saying yes, as long as you're available, as long as your needs remain unspoken. The minute you shift from "what do you need" to "what do I deserve," the dynamic collapses. And this is where many retreat. They call it loneliness, but Machiavelli would call it clarity. Because here's the brutal truth. People are not addicted to you. They're addicted to how you make them feel. Your empathy is a drug. Your consistency is a crutch. Your generosity is a supply line. Cut the line, and their loyalty dies with it. But something strange happens when you no longer depend on that loyalty to define you. You begin to see patterns you ignored for years. The friend who always disappears when you're the one in crisis. The partner who pulls away when you express a boundary. The family member who guilt-trips you the moment you say no. These were not relationships. They were arrangements. Arrangements built on silent contracts. You give, they stay. You stop giving, they vanish. And while that reality can feel like abandonment, it's actually a revelation, because it shows you what love isn't. It shows you what connection without reciprocity really looks like. And more importantly, it forces you to confront your own complicity in that imbalance. Yes, they used you, but you allowed it. Yes, they took, but you trained them to. Why? Because deep down, being needed felt safer than being chosen. Being essential felt better than being seen. Because if they need you, they won't leave, right? Wrong. They leave anyway. They just wait until you stop meeting their needs. And by then, your self-worth is in ruins, because you built it on how valuable you were to someone who never learned how to value you. That's the danger of usefulness. It doesn't just drain you, it blinds you. It convinces you that your identity is rooted in service, not sovereignty. That your place in someone's life is earned through labor, not presence. But what if the opposite is true? What if your greatest power is in what you withhold, not what you offer? What if your silence is louder than your sacrifices? What if walking away, without noise, without explanation, is the act that finally restores your dignity? This is where the game changes, not by becoming cold, but by becoming conscious. By realizing that people who genuinely love you won't keep score. They won't require you to shrink in order to keep them. They won't treat your love like a subscription service they can cancel the moment you stop giving perks. In a world addicted to transaction, your decision to become a man of discernment, to choose when and if you give, is revolutionary and terrifying to those who benefited from your ignorance. But let them be terrified. Because the man you're becoming isn't looking for comfort. He's looking for truth, not just in others, but in himself. And now that you're no longer measuring your worth by how much you give, you're free to ask the question you were too afraid to voice. Who would stay if I had nothing left to offer but myself? That question, right there, holds every answer you've been avoiding. And the journey to those answers starts with a quiet act of rebellion. You stop showing up for people who wouldn't notice if you disappeared. And then you watch what happens. There comes a moment in every man's life when he realizes that love isn't something that's always felt. Sometimes it's merely performed, and when that realization dawns, it isn't loud. It doesn't come with shouting or betrayal or chaos. It comes in the quiet moments, when the phone doesn't ring, when the favor isn't returned, when your absence doesn't echo in their world. You begin to see the machinery behind the relationship, the levers you pulled, the support you gave, the way you morphed into whatever was needed, not out of manipulation, but out of fear. Fear that if you stopped adjusting, they'd stop caring. And often, they do. Because many of the people who surrounded you weren't drawn to your core. They were drawn to your function. The same way a customer is drawn to a service. The same way a beggar is drawn to a hand that feeds. The moment that service slows or the hand closes, so does the attention. This is where the modern man bleeds. In the silence after sacrifice, he remembers every time he stayed up late to comfort her, every bill he paid without being asked, every insecurity he helped soothe, every breakdown he held together. And now, he's the one unraveling, and no one's showing up. Because usefulness is a currency with no refund policy. But you were never taught to question that. From the start, you were rewarded for being easy, for being agreeable, for offering more than you asked. You didn't want to be a burden, so you became a resource. You didn't want to be left behind, so you became indispensable. And what they never told you is that indispensable is just another word for replaceable. The moment your value expires. The people who once praised your kindness now call it weakness. The ones who said you were perfect are now confused. And what hurts the most isn't that they left. It's that they left when you needed them the most. But what if their leaving was the lesson? What if their absence was the cure for the very disease they caused? Because when you're no longer playing the role of the emotional provider, you're finally free to observe the room you've been trapped in, the power dynamic, the emotional manipulation disguised as need, the guilt they fed you like sugar, until you believed it was your duty to always say, yes. You begin to replay conversations, her smile when you fixed her problem, her silence when you asked for support. The imbalance was always there. You were just too invested to see it. And that's not love. That's performance. That's survival. Machiavelli would have called it strategic obedience, a temporary self-betrayal to maintain proximity to power. But in your case, it wasn't strategy. It was longing. And longing is the perfect soil for self-erasure. Until one day, you just stop. You stop answering every call. You stop apologizing for having need. You stop performing emotional CPR on relationships that flatlined long ago. And suddenly, the air feels different. You're not loved less. You're just no longer useful. Which means the love was never real. It was conditional, transactional, mechanical. And now you face a new enemy, the emptiness that usefulness used to fill. But emptiness is honest. It doesn't lie to you. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't guilt trip. It just is. And sitting with that is the first act of emotional maturity most men never reach. Because they're too busy chasing validation from people who only see them as a means to an emotional end. The real shift doesn't happen when you become colder. It happens when you become clearer. When you no longer mistake attention for affection, when you stop translating silence as peace and begin recognizing it as absence, when you stop explaining your worth and start enforcing it, that's when you begin to attract different energy, not from people who want to use you, but from those who see you, who recognize value without extracting it, who offer without needing something in return. But that doesn't happen until you cleanse the part of you that was addicted to being. You were never truly rejected. You were released. Released from a role you outgrew. Released from a contract you never signed. Released from the illusion that being everything to someone would finally make them choose you. But no one chooses a mirror. They only use it to fix themselves. So you shatter the mirror. And in its fragments, you see not who you were, but who you could become if you stopped mistaking usefulness for love. The man who stops being used is not bitter. He is reborn. And that rebirth doesn't begin with a new relationship or a grand gesture. It begins in silence, in the decision to withhold what was once given freely. In the moment you realize that your worth isn't in how often you say yes, but in how powerfully you say no. There's a painful clarity that comes when you stop being useful to someone and realize they were never really looking at you, only at what you provided. The silence that follows is deafening, not because it's empty, but because it finally tells the truth. You thought you were building something with them, a future, a connection, maybe even a love that could weather your insecurities and their chaos, but the whole time they were building something on you, on your energy, your availability, your sacrifices, and now that you've stopped offering, they've stopped caring. They never loved you. They loved the way you filled their emptiness. That's the hardest pill to swallow. Because you gave sincerely. You showed up when no one else did. You listened without judgment. You poured yourself into fixing what they wouldn't even admit was broken. You loved with open hands, hoping they'd choose to stay, not realizing they were only there while the benefits outweighed the cost. And now you're here, looking around, wondering why it feels like everything is missing, except the weight that's finally been lifted. This is the place where most men collapse emotionally, where they become bitter, closed off, resentful. But Machiavelli would offer a different route. He would not tell you to feel less. He would tell you to observe more, to notice the patterns, to catalog the manipulation, to remember that love, like power, is rarely given freely. It is negotiated, it is tested, and it is often exploited. You were taught that love is unconditional, that giving more would bring you closer, that being the better man would one day be rewarded. But the truth is, when you love without limits, you invite people to treat you without restraint. They don't value what's always available, they don't respect what never resists, and they don't fear losing what never walks away. So now, you face a new challenge, rebuilding your identity without the crutch of being needed. It starts small, saying no to things you used to agree to out of guilt, watching who disappears when you stop over-delivering, letting relationships fall apart if they can't survive your boundary. And in that space, between what you used to tolerate and what you now refuse, you begin to see yourself not as less, but as free. The man who was once consumed by usefulness becomes a man defined by presence. He doesn't need to prove his worth by fixing broken people. He doesn't chase after apologies or beg to be seen. He watches, he calculates, he decides who gets access and who only got used to the open door. Because once you've seen how disposable you were to people you would have bled for, you stop offering yourself as a solution. You start becoming a standard. You begin to understand something darker but far more liberating, that many people aren't looking for a partner. They're looking for a host. And as long as you keep feeding their wounds, they'll never heal, and you'll never grow. So you pull back. You disconnect. You let the silence answer the questions they never bothered to ask. You stop fighting for closeness that only left you feeling more alone. And then something strange happens. You stop craving their validation. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head. You stop needing them to understand. Because the truth is, they understood the whole time. They just didn't care. That's when your power returns. Not in some dramatic, vengeful transformation, but in quiet, calculated boundaries, in selective presence, in choosing solitude over shallow company, in becoming so centered in your own self-worth that you no longer feel the need to explain your distance. People begin to notice. Some try to come back, but now your usefulness is guarded, not out of spite, but out of strategy. Because you finally realize the most dangerous thing you can offer someone is access to a man who no longer needs to be needed. That's the man who doesn't chase love. He commands it. That's the man who doesn't beg for respect. He enforces it. And that's the man who, when he's no longer useful, is still unforgettable. Because what made him valuable was never what he gave. It was what he refused to lose in the process: himself.